to Crime in Court. We are reading through the Delphi trial transcript, Indiana versus Richard Allen in the homicides of Libby German and Abby Williams. We are on the state's case, part 24. We just completed the direct examination of Melissa Oberg, who is the firearms examiner, and we are about to dive into her cross examination by Mr. Rosie for the defense. So, without further ado, let us get started. Please hit the like button if you haven't already done so. All right, so Mr. Rosie says, so sufficient agreement is the phrase of art here, right? I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. Well, you just said earlier that you found sufficient agreement between the markings of that item 16 and that gun 314, right? Yes, I did. So the word sufficient, have you ever looked that up in the dictionary? Not in general terms, no, but through the AFTE theory of identification, I have, yes. Okay. If I told you that one of the synonyms for sufficient is enough, would you believe that? People can describe things the way they want to describe things. What kind of an answer is that? What about adequate? Does that sound right? You're reading it from whatever you're reading it from, so it's what you're reading, whatever source you're reading it from. We're starting out with a bang here. I mean, Melissa Oberg is really, I don't even know. What kind of an answer is that? You're reading what you're reading from. So, what? Like she doesn't want to answer the question. She either doesn't know or she doesn't want to answer. She's avoiding it. So it's just enough agreement is where we are with the standard, right? Well, the definition you're reading from is just a layman's term definition, not the definition that's provided through the AFTE theory of identification. Well, is it okay for a juror to utilize the layman's term in the course of making a decision in this case? Mr. Luttrell says, to which I would object that I think that's improper for this question for this witness. Sustained. Is there a problem with me using the layman's terms and layman's synonyms? Objection and ask leave to ask a preliminary question, says Mr. Luttrell. The court says you may. Mr. Luttrell says, in the word sufficient, as stated in your report, is that a term of art in your discipline of firearms and tool mark examination? The witness says the term sufficient comes from the AFTE theory of identification, how it relates to that. So there's more than just saying sufficient. It's based off of knowing the research, the science behind it, and that it all goes to the weight of the term. Okay. Mr. Luttrell says, Your Honor, I would object to the question and to use a phrase I've heard previously, it's apples and oranges to take a term that means something specific in her field and then suggest that it should be used in a more general fashion. The court says, any response? Mr. Rosie says, I think it's an appropriate question asking her what her definition is of the word sufficient. The court says, well, I'll sustain the objection because the definition you're giving is not the definition that she's under. Mr. Rosie says, I'll follow up. Thank you for that. The court says, okay. So did the members of AFTE used Black's or Webster's dictionary when they created the term or phrase sufficient agreement? I wasn't there when they wrote the AFTE theory identification, but the AFTE theory of identification is based on the knowledge that comes from the field. So they can use terminology, but it has to associate to the fields within which you're working in. Okay. So the language you're speaking today in court may be different than the language all of us speaks, right? It's not that it's different, it's that it's in relation to what I do. So then to analogize the words enough or adequate to the word sufficient would be a fair thing to do? In relation to what? This case, this man's guilt. I'm not asserting that those terms that you're using are what the AFTE theory of identification states. We're talking different languages, right? It appears to be, yes. So the language in the AFTE theory of identification must be a separate and different language than the English language. And she agrees. Yes, it is. What? Okay. All right. Just real quick on the video. That video does not make any reference to ejectors, does it? No, it does not. That video doesn't make any reference to extractors, does it? No, it does not. And that video doesn't make any reference to chamber hood marks, does it? It actually references how the barrel is made, so it doesn't say chamber or hood marks, but it actually references how the barrel was made. So even that front portion that includes that chamber face is actually referenced in the video. But they don't use those terms, though, do they? No, they do not. And there's actually a couple of different plants where they manufacture cigs. Is that right? Remember, her whole direct testimony is about how guns are made and the ridges and the grooves and the things and the whatevers. But we still have no idea how a test firing a test firing from Richard Allen Sig Sauer somehow came to the conclusion that the markings are also the same that were on the bullet casing that was found at the scene near the girls. We still don't have any understanding of how that occurred or how she was able to identify that or match them. And we also haven't really been told yet that she had to fire it, not just cycle it through the gun to make it match. So we haven't gotten there yet. We have a long ways to go with this witness. Um, all right, so the question was, and there's actually a couple of different plants where they manufacture cigs. Is that right? There have been different plants where they manufacture them. They have manufactured them overseas, and a lot of their operations are currently here in the United States. Germany? Yes, Germany would be one. It initially started out in Switzerland. Oh, sorry, that was part of her answer. Germany would be one of those foreign overseas companies, and also it started in Switzerland. And I think you touched on this earlier, but that video just demonstrated the basic components of that particular P226 firearm, which is platform and the barrel, right? The handle, I guess. I went through how the manufacturing process works and also how the assembly process works, but in general, yes. But there's a whole bunch of moving parts inside of those firearms that we've been talking about today that were not part of it, correct? The assembly process is actually part of that. So the extractor and the ejector, they all come into the assembly process, but not the manufacturing of it was not shown in that video. No. It's possible that SIGs may actually acquire for example, their ejectors from another manufacturer, right? Correct. So, like, for example, Glock is a handgun manufacturer that we've talked about today. Correct. So it's reasonable to believe that maybe, for example, Glock might actually manufacture ejectors and then sell them in large volumes to SIG to be placed into SIG guns, right? There could be potential to do that. So that does happen in this industry, doesn't it? Yes, it does. I mean, in this case, I believe earlier in one of the lab reports you put in was involved a Smith& and Wesson handgun, right? That's correct. And there was some similarity between the tools in those and the tools in the SIGs. What do you mean similarities? That they have extractors and ejectors? Well, if the ejectors can be found, similar ejectors can be in each of those guns, similar styles and shapes. It would have to fit the actual frame of it, so there may be little nuances that it may or may not fit in that firearm. Same is true for the extractors, right? That's correct. So you've got a lot of different combinations out there in the industry when it comes to tools being placed in certain platforms with certain manufacturers, right? That's correct. And I just counted five off the top of my head. Beretta, Glock, Smith& Wesson, High Point, and another one. How many gun manufacturers do you think there are making s- something pistols? We've got our first in Audible in 10 minutes in. If you just had to take a guess. I really don't want to take a guess, but I know that there's a lot. Dozens? I have no idea. You've been looking at guns for 17 years and you can't make an estimate about how many manufacturers there are? Well, in that sense, before I left my career, there's a lot of black market stuff going on right now and there's a lot of 3D printing going on, so it makes a guess would only not give a sufficient not give it it make a guess I'm reading what's on the page. So it make a guess would only not give it sufficient justice. Okay, court reporter. I don't think that's what she said, but we'll go with it. I think what she's trying to say is that if she were to make a guess, it would not be sufficient. You were a lab technician when you worked for the state police, right? I was never a lab technician. I was either a forensic drug chemist or I was a forensic firearms examiner. You worked in a laboratory? I worked in a laboratory. You did technical stuff, right? I did technical stuff. And there's no minimum requirement in terms of education that's required by AFTE to do the job that you did at the state lab, the state police lab, is there? There is not through AFTE, but through our accreditation standards, we do have to meet them. With the state police, you got to have a minimum. What, a bachelor's degree? A minimum of a bachelor's. But you could have a bachelor's degree in physical education and get a job in the laboratory, couldn't you? In some of the disciplines, you usually need in the criminal justice or hard science category. So those are some of the courses and areas that we look for. Certain disciplines allow different things. A drug chemist, you usually have to have some type of chemistry background, DNA, some type of biology background, and so forth. If you had a degree in physical education, would you meet the minimum requirements to work in the lab at the state police post? Not in all disciplines, no. Okay, what about the one you worked in? In the one I worked in, I believe you had to either have criminal justice or some type of science courses, but you did not have to have a physical degree in that. So you didn't have to have a degree in science. You could have a degree in criminal justice, right? Correct, yes. You could be a sociologist, basically, and work in that laboratory. In our division, but not all of them. You don't even work there anymore, right? I do not. And those are actually civilian positions, aren't they? They're not actually law enforcement positions. That's correct. And you work for a healthcare company. Yes, I do. And you analyze data, right? I do. You told me. We talked back in March, didn't we? Yes, we did. Over here in the room behind us? Yes. Took your deposition. Yes. And you remember telling me that you were thinking about changing your employment back in 2018. So, right after the homicides? Why is everybody who's involved in this case changing careers, retiring, leaving whatever organization they're with at the time of this investigation? It's just very, very sus. So, right after the homicides in 2018, she was already thinking about changing her employment back then. You thought maybe you might jump ship then and try to carry out some other plan, right? Mr. Luttrell says, objection to the term jump ship. I think it's inappropriate. Sustained. Excuse me. You were thinking about leaving. I was thinking about leaving at that. Yes or no, were you thinking about leaving? I don't think I could adequately explain it by just saying yes or no. Really? It's a yes or no question. I'm asking the questions. Were you thinking about leaving? Objection, Your Honor. She indicated she can't answer the question yes or no, and then he persists in asking it. That's appropriate. Mr. Rosie says, Judge, her response, she's non-responsive. So Mr. Luttrell says she was responsive. She said she could not answer the question. The court says, answer the question, please, which is exactly what a judge should do when a witness is not answering the question. So in this regard, I have very, I have no respect for Judge Gall, but if I had any, she'd get it here for making the witness answer the question. So the witness says yes at that time. Yes. Oh, look at that. You can answer it with a yes or no. And you were concerned that there weren't any opportunities for you to be promoted, right? Or very few? There were just not enough areas that I felt that in my 5-year plan that there wouldn't be anything that had changed or been different at that time. And I was thinking to what I wanted to do next, and it could have been staying in the laboratory or it could have been leaving. That's a wishy-washy answer. Your current job has nothing to do with firearms, correct? It does not have anything to do with firearms. Or bullets? No, it does not. Or cartridge cases? No, it does not. You mentioned the word IBIS earlier in your testimony, didn't you? Yes, I did. And that is the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, is that right? Yes. And you'd worked with that system in the course of your employment as a firearms examiner with the state police. Yes, I have. That's a database that stores information regarding cartridge cases, right? Yes, it does. And allows you to compare and contrast images from cartridge cases around the world. It allows you to compare it from state to state if it's requested, but typically it only pulls from the state in which you are currently in. And sometimes those comparisons can be helpful in determining if one cartridge case has similarities with another in one state or two states. It's an investigative tool that will rank things, and at the time when I left, there was an outside agency that actually read the correlations for us. No examinations were actually performed on it. The examination was done by them and it was returned to us. If we ever needed to do an examination, then we would recall the evidence to do an examination. So it's an investigative tool, right? It is. You're not allowed to come into courtrooms and testify about the results from those searches, are you? Only if asked, and it's allowed. But it's not allowed per policy, is it? It's not a definitive conclusion. It's only an investigative tool. So it's not reliable for legal purposes. And one of the most common things you do in your lab or did in your laboratory when you worked there was basically taking a projectile or a cartridge casing and trying to determine if a certain firearm, like 314, for example, discharged that cartridge, right? And that was one of the common exams. I mean, just to be real practical about this, most of the time when you are examining firearms in the course of your employment, you are trying to essentially determine whether or not a projectile or what a lot of people called a bullet was fired from a certain gun, right? It didn't matter whether, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, let me start that again. It didn't matter whether it was fired from a gun trying to come to some type of conclusion. It could have been exclusion, it could have been identification, or it could have been inconclusive. Sorry. Right, but that's the most common thing that you did in the laboratory. Correct, yes. By far, isn't it? Yes. Okay, there's never a time in the course of your work, there was never a time in the course of your work at the state police when you could say with absolute certainty that any particular firearm discharged any particular projectile or bullet, right? We did not give statistical analysis on it. We're not allowed to say to the exclusion of all others. There was never a time when you worked there when you could say that that bullet came from that gun. I cannot say. Correct or not correct? I cannot say it to the exclusion of all others. I can only say, based on my training and experience and throughout the examination process, that I came to an identification conclusion. Was there ever a time when you worked for the state police when you could say a bullet came from a particular gun? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, when was that? Anytime I testify, when I say that it's coming from an identification standpoint, I am identifying it to a particular firearm. I cannot say with any percentage or certainty. I cannot state that. That's not proven in our field. All you're really allowed to do is come in here and say there's some hallmarks, some similarities, right? It's more than just hallmarks or similarities. When I testify to it, it's testifying to sufficient agreement and the identification process, which is a different language than we all speak. That was a good question. The snark. It's different in the sense that the AFTE theory of identification explains it. Okay. Proficiency testing. You talked about that, right? Correct. Lab personnel are all required to engage in proficiency testing, right? Yes, they are. And that's done by an independent agency. Yes. And the idea, if I recall you testifying earlier, is to ensure that you're trying to track whether or not the processes in your laboratory are sufficient, right? We'll use that phrase, word again. The proficiency test is not testing all the laboratory processes because there's no verification process that occurs during the proficiency part. The examiner takes it and they submit the test. So it does not test all the processes because it does not go through the verification process. So the tests are pass or fail. Yes, they are. And you've never failed one, have you? No, I have not. Not in your entire life? I have not. While at the Indiana State Police, I didn't fail any of the proficiency tests. In fact, you even told me you never even made a mistake on any of those tests, right? I did not come to an incorrect conclusion of any of those tests. And you told me when I deposed you that you'd never even made a mistake in the laboratory in 17 years. I'm not familiar with doing that, so you'd have to point that out in the deposition and show me exactly where I've seen that. 1 second, please. May I approach? Says Mr. Rosie. The court says you may. Would it help you to refresh your memory as to our conversation back on March 15th, 2024, here in this courthouse? Yes. When we talked about this issue? Yes. Let me direct your attention to page 18, lines 19 through 22. Just read those first and I'll question you. Read them out loud or read them to myself? Just read them to yourself. I'm sorry. I've got you on the wrong page, ma'am. Page 19. Page 19. Okay. Lines 19 through 22. Just read those and let me know when you've read the lines. Yes. My question to you is, have you ever made any mistakes in terms of identification in the course of your work where, in the 17 years you were there, you concluded something and you later learned that it was wrong? Was that your answer? Not that I'm aware of. Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm kind of limited with space. And you told me, actually, on the page before, that you're not aware of anyone else in the laboratory ever making a mistake, right? Page prior, line 18, I think it is. Are you referring to page 18? 18, lines 21 through 23, 22. Mr. Luttrell says that's relating to proficiency tests. Yeah, for proficiency tests. I'm not aware of anyone in our unit ever failing one. So you've got a perfect laboratory, right? I'm not saying that we're perfect. I'm saying that I was not made aware of anybody ever failing one. And in the course of the 17 years that you were there, how many tests did you do a year, if you could estimate? Approximately 350. Not all of them actually included comparison work, but all of those 350 examinations, they could consist of examining firearms for functionality, but they could also include comparisons. So thousands of them in total? Approximately, I believe when I left there were 6,500 comparisons that I had made. Never made a mistake around that. I cannot attest that I know the ground truth in any of the cases that I worked. An examiner who works casework from criminal justice agencies cannot attest that they have ever made or not made a mistake. It's just whether they were made aware of it, that they made a mistake. So we don't know the ground truth of what happens in any criminal justice cases. We only know the ground truth when we're testing or taking proficiency tests or black box studies. So we really don't know the ground truth about the accuracy of your examination in any particular case, let alone this one. We don't know that in any criminal case. I cannot attest to that. No. The proficiency testing was done by CTS, is that right? No, it was not. Okay, what company did that? Forensic Assurance. Yeah. Okay. And how long have you been using them? Forensic Assurance, I believe we started right around 2014 or 2015. And what did you use prior to that? We used CTS, which is Collaborative Testing Service. And they had a reputation for being a little lax in their tests, didn't they? Or they didn't scrutinize enough, did they? That was one of the reasons that we switched over to Forensic Assurance. Their tests were just not as hard, and so we switched over to Forensic Assurance because of how the tests were made up and they were harder. And there were even attorneys that passed some of those tests with CTS, weren't there? I have no idea if there were or not. So you knew that they were scrutinized. Yes. And so all of those examinations, 66,000 or more, you never really had an opportunity to get promoted, so you left, correct? No, that's not the reason. Let's talk about the tool mark discipline for a second, okay? Okay. Now, just to be fair, just to make sure we're educating the jury, tool mark examination is kind of the umbrella discipline under which firearms examinations falls, right? That's true. But you mentioned earlier you might be examining things like axes or I don't know what you said, knives, hatchets, something that's a metal tool or some kind, a metal substance, right? Anything that can be used to gain mechanical advantage that would make a mark or leave a mark in something that we could examine. And when I talked to you back in March, we talked about the DNA industry, didn't we? Yes, we did. And you pointed out that there were some flaws in that industry, didn't you? There's flaws in all industries, even in the DNA analysis. Yes, and that there was room for improvement in that analysis. There's room for improvement everywhere. But that's widely accepted in courtrooms, isn't it? It is. But courtrooms should not be the measurement of acceptance. Science should be a measurement of acceptance. Objection. And we were comparing the tool mark industry with paternity testing as well, weren't we? I was asked a question about that. And you know what paternity testing is, right? Yes, I do. And you're basically matching DNA between parents and children. Yes. And that's a practice that's acceptable in courtrooms, right? Courtrooms have accepted it, yes. But you told me you didn't know a whole lot about the inner workings of that process, right? No, I've never done any type of DNA testing. That's not a process that you would ever compare with your business in the firearms identification sector, right? No, that's not something that I would compare the same thing to as firearms. In this particular case, you would not have told a law enforcement officer involved in this investigation that the tool mark process is just as reliable as paternity testing? Yikes. He Let me read that question again. You would not have told a law enforcement officer involved in this investigation that the tool mark process is just as reliable as paternity testing. Yeah, no, it's not. Not even by a long shot. What I talked about was the actual error rate in our scientific community, which goes to around 2.5%. And that was, some people had thought, well, if I think about this like paternity testing, I would just flip the numbers around. So that basically you're about 98% accurate. Would you ever have communicated to a law enforcement officer in this case that the tool mark process is just like paternity testing, 99.9% sure that you could match kid with a man? Would you? Asked and answered, Your Honor. I object, says Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Rosie says that was a specific question. Overruled. You may answer. The witness says, okay. No, I. Did you ever tell law enforcement that? Did you ever tell a law enforcement officer that in this case? No. I would not say it's just like paternity testing in that we have the same rate. I wonder if we're going to have a witness who will say that. She told them that. You don't know anything about paternity testing, so it would be kind of reckless to start comparing the two, anyways. Yes, it would. Let's talk about error rates for a minute, okay? Okay. You would agree that a lot of research in the firearms identification industry revolves around error rates. You might have even said that earlier, right? Yes, it does. Lots of studies about error rates of examiners, right? Yes, there is. And the different processes that you use in examining cartridges, cartridge cases, and bullets, yes. Studies to determine the processes within the laboratories themselves. There are some studies of within the laboratory themselves, yes. And there are a lot of professionals that are very supportive of the tool mark industry, right? There are. And that's really what AFTE is, right? These are the people that believe in firearms identification as a subdiscipline of tool mark identification. Yes, they do. But there's also a critical community that exists in the business of firearms identification, isn't there? There are some people, yes. And that critical community is comprised, at least in part, of a lot of educated people. Yes. Doctors. Yes. Scientists. Yes. And even organizations that exist that have been critical of the tool mark industry, right? There, I don't know of a specific industry, but I do know that there are individuals that may have become part of a group. Yes. And there's also a bunch of research focused on trying to introduce new technology to our industry of firearms identification, isn't there? Yes, there is. Trying to move forward and advance this discipline, right? Yes, there is. Because it's not perfect, is it? No. And one of those organizations is PCAST or PCAST, right? PCAST is an organization, yes. The President's Council on, I'm trying to get my acronym again, you tell them. Okay, PCAST is actually, it stands for, just tell them what it stands for. It stands for Objection, Your Honor. I actually, says Mr. Luttrell. Miss Rosie says, I just want her to tell them what PCAST stands for. Mr. Luttrell says he continues to interrupt her. She was, but I withdrew my comment and I apologize to the court. So PCAST stands for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Thank you for that. I struggle with that. That's all right, she says. What's NAS? I know that's the other one. National Academy of Sciences. So PCAST is an organization that has rendered some opinions about the processes involved in firearm identification discipline, right? They have evaluated research, but they have not conducted any of their own research. Okay. But they definitely generated some opinions about the firearms identification discipline. Yes, they have. And they basically kind of work for the President of the United States, right? They are appointed by the area of that. And the people that are on that council are some of them scientists, some of them are scientists, yes. I might be wrong, but some of them may just be lawyers or doctors or lay people, right? I don't know all the people and all their titles on there. Okay. But they're supposed to be kind of an independent body that oversees and critiques different disciplines, not just the firearm discipline, right? Yes, they're there to advise the president. And there's been an ongoing debate in your industry, the firearms identification industry, just about whether or not it's a science in the truest sense, correct? There's a debate from some people, yes. So it's not a generally accepted science, is what Mr. Rosie is getting at. The PCAST did some studies. I'm sure you know the year, probably back in 2013, 14, 15-ish, and they generated some opinions about whether or not the firearms industry, the firearms identification industry, is actually a science, didn't they? PCAST didn't actually do any studies, so I'm not quite sure what your... Okay, fair enough. They published some literature, right? In 2013, 2014, not on forensics. Okay. Tell them when PCAST published their report that contained an opinion about the firearms and toolmark industry. It would have been 2016, so a year before the homicides. Okay, thank you for that. Yes. And that report basically concluded that the firearms identification industry is not a science in the truest sense, didn't it? No, they did not conclude that. Then what did they conclude? They concluded that there needed to be more black box studies to assess examiner performance and how it works. So what needed, uh, they felt that we needed to do more black box studies to provide what examiner performance rates are like. And they were critical that you weren't vetting your own industry enough, right? They were critical that we didn't have enough black box studies to show that and be able to assess and tell jurors how examiners perform. We had plenty of research, but not the research that they wanted, which were the black box studies. And they published, in part at least, well, strike that. NAS is the other organization, the National Academy of Sciences, is that right? Yes. They also have been critical of the toolmark industry, haven't they? Yes, they have. And specifically the firearms identification discipline within Toolmark. They were critical of all the forensic science disciplines. Well, they looked at many of the different disciplines and rendered some opinions about the reliability of those disciplines, right? They have looked at research and reliability of those, and they have come to certain opinions, but no actual physical testing was done. Okay, but one of the opinions they generated about the firearms identification industry was that you need to have independent laboratories, right? That was one suggestion, yes. And that was one of the most significant ones because it requires a lot of time and energy and money to accomplish that, right? Yes. And what they're basically saying is that because you're so closely connected to law enforcement, there are concerns about the biased nature of the work, right? It was a recommendation to do that, to have them separated. That way, there wouldn't be any undue or miscarriages of influence that could potentially happen if it was so that they felt that moving it out of any type of organization that oversees police work would be ideal. That hasn't happened. At the Indiana State Police, where I worked at downtown in Indianapolis, we were actually connected to the Department of Toxicology and the Department of Health. At the time when I left, there were only two sworn officers in the building, so all the people that make up the area that I was in were actually laboratory scientists and personnel. But you're state employees, aren't you? Yes, well, all of us are. And you work hand in hand with the police and the courts in your business all the time when you were there. And what do you mean by hand in hand? Well, they came into your laboratory, bring you items in for inspection and things of that nature, don't they? They bring them to the evidence clerks. They don't necessarily bring them to us, but I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. I couldn't walk in there and hand you something and ask you to test it, could I? I've actually had a case where a defense attorney did relinquish evidence to our laboratory to be tested. One time? Yes. But that's not something that happens on a normal basis, is it? It's not on a consistent basis, no. And with the NAS, the second recommendation outside of the independent laboratories was that there be a further examination of the scientific foundations and limitations on several of the disciplines, including tool mark identification or firearms identifications, right? Objection, Your Honor. I'd like leave to ask a preliminary question. You may, says the court. Mr. Luttrell says NAS has issued more than one report that encompasses firearms or just one? Just one. And when was that? The National Academy of Sciences was released in, I think, 2009. 2009. So the reference by Mr. Rosie is a 2009 study. Yes, it is. Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. I'll not object. When was the video made? That video was made back, I think, about 10 years ago. Okay, yeah. So the recommendation from the NAS was that there be further research to examine the scientific foundations and the limitations in your industry. Yeah. So, in other words, they were questioning the entire discipline, the entire foundation of the discipline back in 2009. What they wanted was more research to prove our reliability and accuracy of that. And the NAS was not issued a supplemental report saying that they're happy now, are they? They have not issued a subsequent report that I am aware of. And I had highlighted this because that was a good breaking point because now he's switching topics, but I don't think I need to stop it just yet. We're going strong and we're going to continue going on because it's hard to break these up into bite-sized portions sometimes. All right. So would you agree? Now let's talk about the research in the industry. Would you agree with me that there is a lot of research in your industry as it relates to the comparison between bullets, projectiles? Which word do you prefer? So it depends what you're actually trying to reference here. So cartridge would be the entire unit of ammunition or a cartridge case or a bullet. Okay, I'm talking about the end, the business end of it. Okay, the bullet. Okay, in your language, they call them bullets, right? That's correct. Not projectiles? You can call it. The slang term would be projectile, but we typically call it a bullet. Okay, same thing? Yes. So most of the research, the bulk of the research in your industry revolves around comparing bullets with firearms, right? There is bullets and there is also cartridge cases, yes. Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Bullets with a particular firearm? Correct, yes. Kind of the traditional sense of, hey, somebody fired a gun and we recovered the bullet, we're trying to compare it back to the gun, right? In that sense, yes, looking to see whether a bullet can be identified to a particular firearm. There's another kind of subset where there's research regarding identifying the size or caliber of a bullet that's recovered, right? There is. There's research on being able to determine that, yes. But that research is pretty lean, correct? Yes, there is. And there's some research on the impact of the tool. Strike that. Chamber marks. You know what chamber marks are? Yes, I do. We haven't really talked much about those today, right? No, we haven't. And that's part of those kind of marks could be on around like inaudible in a sense, right? Yes, they could be. There's some research on that, but they're also pretty lean, right? Yes, it is. And that describes the marks that are on that are impressed or striated on that cartridge when it's cycled in and out of the firearm, right? Yes. And there's just really not much there in the industry to really put on them. There's enough research to be able to know that one can do it and they can be able to identify it back to a particular firearm. But you told me back in March it's quite lean, didn't you? There are not a lot of articles, but there are some out there. But that was the word you used, right? Yes. Now, of most significance in this case in your examination or the examination of an unspent cartridge, right? Yes. So we're talking, just to be really simple here, spent rounds are a fired round versus an unspent round. Correct. Correct. And there's a definite distinction between those two things, isn't there? There's a definite distinction in how it works or in how it occurs, yes. So you kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier, didn't you? Yes. And one of the biggest distinctions is that a spent round or a fired round is subject to the pressures, I guess if you will, or the obvious pressures that are created by a firearm when the trigger is pulled. That's correct. I mean, duh. That's what I said in the last stream. Like one of the biggest differences is the pressure in the back of the gun and the bullet powder not igniting and things like of that nature. There's a huge difference in of pressure when you are firing a gun versus cycling it through a chamber. And so a spent round is subject to an entirely different environment, a contained environment in this situation than an unspent round. Well, they're all loaded into the firearm the same way. The pressure is what's the difference between the two. So two different circumstances are responsible for creating two different marks, right? It's still the same process. It's loading it in there. It still goes in the same way, but there's a difference in pressure, really. So two circumstances are responsible for creating two different types of tool marks. An ejector marks an ejector. An ejector marks an ejector mark, whether it's cycled or fired, so it's not different. There could be differences in the marks that are replicated, but an ejector mark is an ejector mark. It doesn't somehow become something else. Does that explain anything? No. I appreciate that. An ejector's gonna make a mark, no matter how you look at it, right? Well, an ejector is going to make a mark if it comes into contact. It could maybe not make a mark if the pressure is not great enough. But that's a material distinction in your line of work, those two different cycles. Mr. Luttrell says, which two different? I would object. Mr. Rosie says, a fired round versus an unfired round. So, yes, a fired round is something that will have different pressure asserted to it. An unfired round will not have the same or similar pressure. Now, you talked about the ability to analyze the marks left on an unfired round, didn't you? Yes. And there's not much research available in that area either, is there? There's leaner research in that as associated to the cycling process of it. But you just said the word, when we talked before, you used the word lean in terms of research. Yes, lots of room to improve in in that particular area of research. If you're just associating the process, yes, but not the tool or the tool marks that come from it. Really? You're going to defend the tool marks when you literally just said the pressure is different. And sometimes it can make marks and sometimes it doesn't. Okay. She's going to die on her, or die on that hill with this argument, I guess, even though she's no longer in this business. But there's lots of room to improve the research standpoint. As far as, yes, the cycling and the fire process, yes, but not the tool marks that come from it. And the research is what helps drive, say, like error rates, right? In that particular instance, it just depends how you're looking at it. Do you want a black box study to be able to determine those errors, or are you looking for research in the fact that you just want to see how cycling works or how cycling is produced from the tool marks that it comes in contact with? One of the reasons why there's not a lot of research is because when you have uncycled cartridges, you don't often have people hurt, right? It's just kind of common sense. Typically, when you have it, it depends what's going on in the case. And I don't know that for a fact, but I mean, we get a lot of times a lot of unfired cartridges with the cases that we receive. It's just typically, it's not the only item of evidence that we receive. So there's no proficiency testing involving analyzing unfired cycled cartridge cases, is there? There's no proficiency test that goes directly to unfired cartridges. However, the marks that are represented on a fired cartridge case also consist of cycling marks. But that doesn't mean that a cartridge that is unspent, unfired, would have the same firing marks as one that has been fired. This is so backwards ridiculous. I can't even believe we're here. Is there any proficiency testing involving unfired cartridges? Yes or no? Asked and answered. The witness says no. Sustained. She's answering. She's talking beyond the question. It's non-responsive, says Mr. Rosie. The court says she did answer that one specifically, so I would sustain the objection. Mr. Rosie says thank you. All proficiency testing for forensic assurance purposes involve test-fired bullets? Yes, it does. And your conclusion in this case comes from an analysis of a fired round, not an unfired cycle. Does it? Doesn't it? I guess I'm not really following. I had both fired and cycled with my test fires, and I did a comparison to an unfired round. But it's the test fires that you use to draw your conclusions, isn't it? It is. Yes. Ridiculous. Not the cycled rounds? It is. That's correct. So you started working on this case in February of 2017. Yes. I think they needed to drive that home a little better, make that clearer for the jury. You received some information early on about the crime scene circumstances you told me. The only thing that I had was provided on the request for laboratory examination that was provided to me. And that was pretty normal back in the day when we first started. You would get information about what went on at the crime scene, right? Basically, whatever the officer wrote up there would be on there. In this case, there was one sentence that talked about, I don't recall from memory exactly what it was, but that there had been a crime that had occurred and it involved two girls. Well, we're trying to get away from the kind of information in the laboratory, so it's so it's more independent. Yes, eventually, by the time I left, we had gotten rid of that information and the ability to actually put that on the request for a laboratory examination sheet. And they don't do that anymore at all, right? That's correct, yeah. So let's talk about your initial examination of item 16, okay? Okay. Your first impressions of that item were that they were really nothing remarkable on the round itself, right? Yes, I didn't notice any biological material. I didn't notice anything adhering to it, and there didn't appear to be any corrosive, sorry, material to it or nature to it. So no dirt or any residue on it or anything. I didn't observe anything like that. And you thought maybe it came from a laboratory? What do you mean? The DNA laboratory. I received the item from the DNA analyst, correct. So the cartridge case might have been examined before you got it. Yes, the cartridge was received from the DNA analyst in this case. And when you looked at it, there were three ejector marks on it, right? Yes, three ejector marks. Yes. So that tells you that the round most likely had been cycled through a firearm at least 3 times? Yes. So, but you said that there was no wealth of forensic information on that round, right? I said that there was not. In the chamber mark area, I did not notice a wealth of area there. But as far as the ejector and extractor areas, there were marks of value there. You told me, when I took your statement back in March, that there was no wealth of information on that particular cartridge after you examined it, right? Well, there's also information as far as the ejector marks, the extractor mark, but there is no firing process that happened to it. So there's no breech face marks and so forth. Not nearly as much as you might find on a fired round, right? That's correct. And based on the information you acquired when you first examined that round in 2017, you would have never communicated to a police officer that, quote, you, the officer, gets me the correct 40 caliber Sig Sauer that I will match it with that gun. You would have never said something like that, would you? I never said I needed a Sig Sauer to identify to. I said that if a firearm is found, there may be the ability to be able to identify it back to a particular firearm. So you never mentioned the word Sig Sauer? I told them that a Sig Sauer could be a possibility as a firearm that could have cycled this firearm. I mean, cartridge. So you were already starting to draw some conclusions about potential for the round back in 2017. I was not drawing conclusions. I said that there was the potential. I also did not say that it was only a Sig Sauer. There were other firearms that could be of interest, such as a Smith& Wesson. It would be improper to make an opinion like that in advance of your full examination, wouldn't it? Yes, I cannot say definitively. I can only tell you, hey, there's a potential that there is the ability to be able to identify it if a firearm is found. So in October of 2022, you examined that particular round again, right? Sorry, what? October of 2022. 2022, yes, correct. And I think you mentioned earlier that you were pretty familiar with it. It had kind of been traveled back and forth to your laboratory a number of times, right? Yes. I had examined it on the first occasion when I received it, and on the second occasion when I received it. This would be the third occasion that I received it. So you test fired 4 rounds, right? Which gun, which time? In October of 2022. In Oc- Talking about, sorry, go ahead. In October of 22, when I received this firearm, I test fired it and cycled it a total of 10 times. 4 test fires, 6 cycles, right? That's correct. And that was item 314. It's Richard Allen's Sig Sauer gun. That's correct. And you didn't view any of the test cycled rounds or test fired rounds microscopically before you actually did your testing? I'm sorry, I don't know that I follow. I guess I don't understand what you mean. You agree with me that you didn't examine those test fires or test cycled rounds microscopically before you did the testing. Oh, to say, are you asking about whether they had marks on it prior to actually test firing it? Well, those are stock rounds, right? They were stock rounds, yes. So they came from like a vault or something where you pull them out and use them for these types of things. We have boxes of ammunition. My point is that you didn't examine those under a microscope before you did that. I did not examine them under a microscope, but I visually observed them before I used them. Well, that's not the same thing, is it? When you've already testified that your microscope can really zoom in and you can see all those marks and scratches and things that you can't see with your naked eye. Now, just for ease of identifying some objects, these are the biggest exhibits you've probably ever seen. But let me I'm just going to go through these real quick. Defendant's Exhibit EE. Do you recognize this generally? Yes. Okay. Is this the firearm we've been talking about all day? Item 314. Yes. Okay. This is a photo that you took. Well, I can't say that it's a photo that I took. I don't know that. I can't specify that because I don't know what you're actually acquiring it from. You have a 14-page report in this case? Yes, I do. And it looks pretty much identical to the one in your report. It looks similar. The court says, could you not display those exhibits until they've been admitted? Mr. Rosie says, oh, I'm sorry. The court says, thank you. Mr. Rosie says, well, these are my exhibits. Court says, well, I understand that. Mr. Rosie says, yeah. Court says, but they haven't been admitted. Mr. Rosie says, right. Can I just show them to her? The court says, yes, please. Mr. Rosie says, sorry about that. The court says, that's okay. Mr. Rosie says, well, actually, they're in the slideshow, so all but just a few of them. So I'll go through them. FF, is this a photograph of item 316 that's referenced in your report? It looks similar, yes. Okay, exhibit GG is a photo of item 315, a second round that's referenced in your report. Yes. HH, a photograph of a couple magazines that's referenced in your report. Yes. And II, a photograph of some Blazer cartridge rounds that were removed from one of the magazines. Yes. JJ, another photograph of Blazer rounds that were removed from one of the magazines. Yes. And you had some test fires. We looked at some of these on the slideshow earlier, right? I'm showing you KK. Is this an image of item 314, which is a test fire, and item 16, which is a bullet or the unspent round over here side by side? Yes. This would be the chamber marks? No. Or extract, what marks are these? They are marks that are located on the head of the cartridge. And then LL, another microscopic image of test fire 1 and item 16, right? Yes. Also referenced in your report. Yes. So MM, another microscopic image of item 314, which is a test fire, and item 16. So these are comparison microscopic images of the test fire versus the unspent bullet found at the scene, which is item 16. She says, yes. So you referenced in your report. Yes. And item NN, same question, same answer basically. Yes. And item OO, is that a microscopic image of item 16 and a test fire 1? Yes. That's the ejector mark, right? Yes. And then at the end, PP, also another microscopic image of item 16 and 316, which is one of the rounds that was collected. I call it one of the closet rounds. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, this is also in your report. Yes, it was. Do all of these truly and accurately depict your conditions that existed at the time that you took the pictures or whoever in your lab took them? Yes, they do. I move to admit, Judge. Defendant's exhibits EE through PP were offered. The court says, I need the number of the items again. He says, I'm sorry. Where did you start? He says, EE through PP. You have a GG in there? I didn't hear it either. Mr. Luttrell, do you have a GG in there? I didn't hear it. Mr. Rosie says EE, FF, GG, HH, II. And what is GG? Item 315. Okay, Mr. Luttrell? No objection. All right, without objection, EE through PP are admitted. Mr. Rosie says, thank you for that. We'll get back to those in a minute. So, just to kind of lay out the separate items here. So, number one, this is the Sig Sauer we're talking about, right? Yes. And I should say number EE. Then FF, I think one of the problems with these is they're not tall enough to lean kind of on the table. And then FF, I've got this labeled closet or a blazer closet cartridge. You see that? Yes. Is it fair to say that on your packaging there's a reference that this was removed from the closet? I believe maybe on the examination request there might be, but let me double check that. If I could just hand you maybe. So that was 315, are you saying? Yes. 315 said, found in wooden keepsake box on dresser between both closets in master bedroom. Okay, so there's a reference to the closet in there? Yes, there is. And then 316, or I'm sorry, well, we just talked about 315. Yes, 315 and 316 are two rounds that both have closet references to them, right? 316 is actually the Sig Sauer handgun. Or wait, hold on. Want me to just hand you the two exhibits? Hold on. Yeah, sorry. Okay, 315. Yes, okay, sorry. Is the Winchester. Yes, correct. Smith& Wesson or S&W 40 caliber round, it references the closet on there, right? Yes, it does. And then 316 is the blazer round that references the closet on the packaging. Correct. Yes. Thank you. And then the two cartridges, item 317, that was referenced, right? 317. Magazines, two magazines. Yes, two magazines containing cartridges. And then just because the jury hasn't seen these, well, when they publish the other exhibits, I guess, next time I'll make them in color. 317A, these are rounds that were taken out of the magazines in 317 and placed in the boxes, right? Yes, in the manila envelopes. All right, and 317 being again taken from the second one of those magazines and placed in a cartridge boxes, right? Yes. So item 16, let's talk about item 16. It's in this package. We haven't actually seen it, but it's in here, right? I cannot verify that until I actually open it. You can squeeze it and tell there's something in there, correct? There's something in there, yes. Okay. And an item 16 is a Smith& Wesson 40 caliber Winchester round, right? Not correctly the way you stated it. It should be a Winchester 40 Smith& Wesson caliber cartridge case. Manufactured by Winchester? Manufactured or marketed by Winchester. A very common round, isn't it? Yes, it is. And Winchester's one of the most reputable and recognizable manufacturers in the firearms industry, right? I can't speak to their anything like that. I can just say that yes, they do manufacture a lot, and it's something common that I would see. Okay, have you been to one of their plants? Yes, I toured Winchester over in Illinois when it was there, but it has since moved. But you can't speak to the reputation of the company? It's not whether for me to judge their reputation or not. You agree that they manufacture millions and millions of rounds, though. They manufacture a lot of ammunition. Yes, they do. It's not reckless for me to say millions, is it? Not, no, it wouldn't be. And there's really nothing unique about the manufacturing characteristics of that round, is there? No, there's nothing unique. You might use a round like that. Item 16 for personal protection. Yes, that is correct. I guess theoretically, you could hunt with it, right? I don't know what the hunting laws are in Indiana, but if it's allowed, sure. Or you might use it to target shoot. Yes, that's correct. Multiple uses, right? Yes. And that particular round, item 16, has multiple markings on the round, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And you talked earlier, it could have been cycled at least 3 times. That's correct. And it could have been cycled more than through more than one firearm. It could have at least been cycled in one firearm, and the areas that I identified go back to a particular firearm. There are times where you could have had something cycled in a firearm, but it did not pick up enough marks. So there is the potential you could cycle another firearm and it didn't pick up enough identifiable marks. But it could have been cycled through multiple firearms. I guess I'm not following as to what you mean by that. Well, you said there were 3 cycling marks, right? Correct. There's 3 cycling marks. The ejectors were 3 triangular marks. They were similar in nature to each other. They each had similar individual marks to an extent, but not all of them had the same degree of individual marks. So possibly it could have been cycled through other firearms. There is a potential that it is possible. And you can't make any determination as a firearm examiner as to when those cycling marks were impressed upon that unspent round. No, I cannot. You cannot say with any sense of certainty that that round was cycled at all in 2017, can you? I cannot tell you whether it was cycled at all at that time frame in there. Like I didn't collect the evidence. I can't testify to that. But there's nothing unique about that round and the marks on that round that help you determine when that round was last cycled and when it was cycled in its entirety, however many. No, I cannot determine that. Okay. So you compared at some point items 315 and 316 with item 16, right? Yes, I did. 315 being the 2 rounds, one of them was the Winchester round, I apologize, closet round, forgive me, and the Blazer closet round, right? There was one cartridge in each of those, but yes, I did compare them to the item 16 because you received those kind of individually as opposed to the rounds you got from that magazine, right? That's correct. And of all those items that were given to you in this examination, 315 is actually the most similar. 315 is actually the most similar to item 16 in terms of manufacturing and make. That's correct. Make and model. I'm thinking about cars. We've heard about hatchbacks, makes and models, right? Basically manufactured or marketed by, yes. And in fact, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't have a photo. I think we do have one from earlier, but I don't have a photo of item 16. This was admitted earlier, states number 278. You remember seeing this particular exhibit? Yes. Can I move freely, Judge? I'm knocking a lot of exhibits down. The court says, yeah. Miss Rosie says, thank you. This 4-page exhibit, which has the photos on it. Yes. This is item 16, right? Yes. And this is item 16. Did you take these photos? Yes, I did. Photographed from different angles? Yes. And different sides? Yes. It's important to do that to document the totality of what you're seeing, right? Yes, you can either document it either photographic wise or through typing it out in notes. Okay. You can't sit here today and say with any certainty that this photograph came from a particular location before it got to you today. Well, I took that photograph, so I examined the evidence at my place, so I can't. I guess I'm not sure really where you're going with it. You can't say with any certainty where it came from before it got to you? No, I cannot. You issued a 14-page report in this case, didn't you? Yes. And in that report, do you have the report in front of you? Yes. I direct your attention to page 1 of that report. Are you there? Yes. Is there a photo of item 16 on page 1? On page 1 of this one, no, there is not. What about page 2? No, there is not. What about page 3? No. 4? No. 5? No. 6? No. 7? No. On page 7, there is a photo of this bag, right? Yes, there is. But not a photo of the round inside of it. No. Page 8. Now you're down to the microscopic photos, right? Yes, I am. So there's not a photo on this page similar to the one that was in Exhibit 278, right? That's correct. Page 9, basically similar to page 8. Yes, that's correct. Microscopic images. Yes. Page 10, same thing, basically. Yes. Page 11? Yes. And then page 12, there's a photo of the head stamp on the ground, right? Yes, there is. That's a test fire? Yes, that is a test fire. But no photo of item 16 here. No, there's not. Again, with the not photographing the bullet that was found, the casing that was found at the scene. Enough. They didn't photograph it enough. It's not in her report with all these other things that where it should be. Page 13, microscopic images. I do want to clarify, they are microscopic images of 16 in some of these microscopic photos, so it's not the complete photo, no. Not the traditional photo like in this exhibit, no. And page 14, no. And that's the last page of your report, correct? That's correct. So you don't have one photo of that round in your 14-page report. In this one, no, I don't, because it actually is in my original set of my notes when I first examined it. How do you, what? Why would it be in your notes and not your final report? So there's not one in this 14-page report. No, this is the report that you had given the police. The report that I give to the police is not through this. I give them the actual certificate of analysis. Well, I've asked you for information more than once, haven't I? Yes, you have. And when I asked you the first batch of information that I requested, you gave me this, right? You asked for notes and the certificate of analysis. So, yes. Bench notes, I think is the way we phrase it in the industry, right? Yes. Which pretty much says, give me a copy of your entire file, right? Yes. Because you don't actually give those to the prosecutor when you generate the certificate of analysis with your conclusions, do you? No, I don't. So after you did this examination and the dust settled, so to speak, those are my words, you were finished. You generated a COA or a certificate of analysis, right? That's correct. And that certificate of analysis has some summaries about what your findings were. That's correct. And that certificate of analysis, in this case, didn't contain any photographs, did it? No, it does not. It doesn't include a 14-page report? No, it does not contain that with it. So basically, the cops don't get any of the information. They just get a certificate of analysis saying, I analyzed this and I think it's the same or similar or whatever her terminology was. So, so lawyers like me have to ask for those things, don't they? They sure do. It's a weird answer. And so we sent a request to say, hey, give me everything you got. They'll ask for specific things, correct? And that's what I did. Yes. And so you ended up releasing this later. Yes, I did. And microscopic images that I asked for. Yes. Basically, a copy of your file, right? Yes. But nowhere in the information that you gave me was there a photo of that round, was there? There should have been because that's what's pulled from that because what why can I not talk? There should have been because what that's pulled from is from the release to you. I still don't understand the answer of that, but okay. Okay, well, certainly wasn't in the 14-page report, correct? It was not in that report, no. Which is really the summary of everything. It's actually not, because every report I did had something in it. So, I mean, this does not summarize everything that I did from every single exam. So, let's talk about the firearm and that round. With this particular evidence, yes, but I also referenced the initial set of notes that can be looked at to see that information. No photo, right? Not in that set, no. So that item 16, when you got it from the police, had no prominent ejector marks, is what you said, right? Which item? I don't understand. 16. No, I'm sorry, 315. We're going back to 315. Okay. 315. Yes, I did not observe a prominent ejector mark. Item 16, however, did have a prominent ejector marks, didn't it? It did, yes. So one significant difference between these two items? Yes. So there's another big significant difference there. So there's no way to conclude that item 315 was even cycled through 314, right? Yes, I was not able to determine that. Item 316, the second round, this is not quite as similar to the first, as the first to item 16, because it's the blazer, right? That's correct. That round had 3 ejector marks on it. Yes, it did. Cycled at least 3 times. Yes. And I think you said it had apparent multiple extractor marks. Yes. But you couldn't find any sufficient agreement between item 315 and 314 and that firearm up there. I found some marks of value, but I could not there was not enough marks to be able to be able to identify it back to that firearm. The round that came from apparently the closet, right? Said to be, yes. So basically, there's a few rounds that were found, item 315 and 316. Those two closet rounds were not really helpful in you connecting item 16 with this firearm. No, I mean, I was not able to identify them to each other or the firearm that was submitted to me. If I were to something something about this, we have another inaudible, which is dangerous in this situation, I would say you were trying to cross reference them and you didn't have any luck doing it, right? Basically, I was not able to see an association to item 16 to 315 and 316, nor was I able to see any additional information that would have alluded to the fact that it was identified as having been cycled in the firearm in item 16. So let's talk about the test fired rounds, or test cycled rounds, sorry. We don't really have a photograph of those. Is that correct? That's correct. Okay. So, just to remind the jury, when you received this firearm, just to make sure we're clear, I was thinking about taking it out and doing it myself. You know what? I'm actually going to do that. May I? The court says, do what? Can we just approach? He asked to approach. Sidebar conference conducted. I guess I'm okay taking a break whenever you are, says Mr. Rosie. I don't need one. I just want you, don't be afraid to cut me off. The court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, I know this is going to take a while. So the court says, okay. Mr. Rosie says, I'm okay with you just. What are you opening? Mr. Rosie says, I'm going to take the firearm out. Okay. Mr. Luttrell says, are you handing it to her? No, I'm going to hold it myself. The court says, I don't know what your level of expertise is in handling firearms, so I'd rather she handled it. She's an expert. Mr. Rosie says she's going to have to put gloves on to do that. The court says, yeah, I assume. Yeah, she's saying yes. Mr. Rosie says, I'll just move on. The court says, okay. And we're going to stop right there. So just for tomorrow, we will continue where we left off with this sidebar conference concluding they're going to start talking more about the firearm and looks like he might, it doesn't look like he's having her take it out. I don't know. So he says no, he's going to back off on that. So he's not going to bring the firearm out. So whatever, we're going to move on. But we will move on tomorrow because um, that's all I have for you today, unfortunately, because I can't read forever. So that is what we have. We're still in the middle of Melissa Oberg, and she's going to be on the stand at least one or two more episodes, I want to say. She's going to be on for a while, so just be prepared. All right, I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, all the YouTubey things, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care. Bye now.